sir.
All right, the recording is starting now. So we can go ahead and get into this. So hopefully everybody has watched the previous video and saw the basics, the introduction to HTML, and was able to HTML and CSS and was able to get the test code that we had set up already. We're going to be going off of this and sort of adding more to it. So make sure that you do that. Otherwise, just feel free to stay in this session, ask any questions that you need, and then go back and do that code. I can also paste it in the future. I think I'll put it, in the future we'll probably put it on like GitHub or something. But I'll go ahead and put the code that we've worked on so far in the Discord. And then that way, if you haven't watched the first video, that you can go ahead and have that. Styles, CSS. Awesome. There you go. So you'll have those two files. Make sure you have them in your VS Code. Go ahead and drag this over here so you guys can see it. Go ahead and start your live server here. That way you can see the Discord. All right, awesome. Let me get back to this. All right, so today we are going to be learning, let me move this camera real quick, make sure that I'm in view. Because if I recall, I'm not. All right, that will have to work. All right, so today we are going to be covering the introduction to JavaScript. So as we saw in the previous video, we started to cover basics of HTML and CSS, but it's pretty flat. It's not interactive at all. I mean, you can create links to other sites as we saw, but that's about the only interactivity that we have. And there's not really much that you can do in pure HTML and CSS to make it interactive, other than obviously links to other sites. So that's what JavaScript allows you to do. So if you have any sort of, if you ever seen like fancy animations or the drop-down boxes, pretty much anything that is not static, when you first open the site and you don't move your mouse, that would be HTML mostly, and CSS for styling. And then once the website does anything, then that's mostly JavaScript. Now, with the exception of there is some like responsive stuff based off the size of your browser and everything, but for the most part, HTML, CSS for static content, JavaScript for dynamic content. So before we get started on the JavaScript, I do want to cover a common terminology that you'll see in web development. This is the terminology of front-end versus back-end. So a lot of people have probably already heard of it before, but it's important to have a good idea of this because JavaScript blurs the line of what it means to be front-end and back-end. Originally, JavaScript was a front-end only programming language, and if you ask older developers, they'll probably still tell you that JavaScript is a front-end language, only a front-end language, especially if they're not up to date with modern JavaScript. JavaScript has improved significantly over the past couple of years. They used to, you couldn't even do like multi-threaded operations or pretty much a lot of fancy things. The problem with JavaScript is that had made it move so slow is that whatever JavaScript that you want to write has to be implemented by the browser. So they created something called ECMA, ECMA, which decides, and it's called, the full thing is ECMAScript. So if you see ECMAScript, ECMAScript is the standard that JavaScript, that the JavaScript applies to. And all of the browsers have to comply with a certain version of ECMAScript. I think the latest is 8, if I recall. I think they're moving, it might be 2018, 2019. I think they moved to a yearly release, but it's been most of the newer features that have coming out aren't as important as the ones that were released around 2013, 2014, 2015. That's when JavaScript really started making the big changes. So back to front end and back end. So front end, as we have been working with, is the design, the formatting, the styling, and then what JavaScript handles is responsiveness and interactions. So all of these things, all of that on the front end is handled by HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now the back end can be built on a number of different languages. But the most popular right now is Node.js. And as you can probably figure, Node.js, it is built with JavaScript. So JavaScript is both a front and a back end. There are massive libraries in Node.js, just like if you've ever programmed Python before, you can install a bunch of libraries for Python. Node has the same thing. Instead of pip, you have npm, and you can install a bunch of user-created libraries. You can use it to make APIs. You can use it to handle authentication. Obviously, certain functionality, some server-side, sometimes you need to do like some server-side processing. And then data management, creating and modifying schemas, as well as adding that to libraries. You use that you would define all that in JavaScript on the back end. And whenever somebody says front end and back end, that is usually two distinct systems. One would be hosting the front end, one would be hosting the back end, and they would communicate over an API. So front end and back end are usually completely separate. Keep that in mind. As we were just talking about, it is both a front and back end language. In the beginning, we're going to be covering front-end JavaScript, and in next meetings, we'll be covering back-end JavaScript. Now, as you can see in this little picture I have here, you can see the server is the back-end here. You have PHP, ASP.NET, Java, Node.js, Python. Those are some common ones, but anything that can handle network requests can be a back-end server. So keep that in mind. Now, there's also database in here. We'll cover databases at some point, but for the most part, for what we're going to be doing, for right now, we're not going to worry too much about databases. Once you have a good understanding of JavaScript, implementing and adding databases is fairly simple. You do not need to be some sort of database master to understand how to create a database and add a user in the database or something. It's not too difficult to understand. So, to the actual code. Now, I didn't go over inline CSS last meeting, and I'll show you how to do it in this video or in this meeting. But JavaScript can also be done inline and with a separate file. This means that you can write script tags at the very beginning of your of your HTML file and just write JavaScript code inside the script tags. But it's generally recommended to use the source tag, the source attribute here, to make sure that it goes to that you're using an external script, because a lot of times you'll have a bunch of functions and you don't want to clutter up your HTML with a bunch of scripts and everything. You generally want to keep these distinct and separate. So let's get into some basic JavaScript. If you've ever used Python and even C++ to an extent, you'll be very, very familiar with a lot of this stuff. JavaScript is dynamically typed, just like Python, which means that you do not need variable types. So there's no int, there's no string, there's no double, float, whatever. There's no data types on the front. There is data types in the back. And eventually we'll look at TypeScript, which is a version of JavaScript that is strongly typed. But we'll be using JavaScript for now. So basically you define it with var. Var pi equals 3.14, person equals John Doe, answer equals yes I am. You define these, and these are your variables, and you just reference them with their name. We will also at some point learn about, in the next meeting we'll learn about let and const. We'll see an example of const soon, but let is another version of var, but basically when you're looking at when you're trying to determine which variables can see other variables, you'll change var or let, but let is a little bit more strict. So if you just want it to work, even though it's not going to be best practice necessarily, we'll use var. Const is there. Const is, well, as it says, constant. So it's the same as var, but it cannot be changed. So if I was going to go in here and say answer equals yes I am, but you wanted to go and change it to no I am not, and it was const, you would not be able to do that. It's good for defining things that only get defined once. It's good programming practice to define everything as const unless you know you are going to be changing it. So we know how to sort of create variables and stuff on the back, but we need to be able to interact with the user in some way. Now, we're not quite advanced enough to do anything fancy like drop-down menus or HTML forms and fancy stuff like that. So we'll be using simpler forms of this, such as alert, prompt, and confirm. So as it says on the slide, alert opens a text box, and it'll show a prompt, and you just click OK. Prompt opens a input field that you would enter some input, and then it'll return the value of that input, and you can use whatever they inputted. And then confirm will open an OK cancel prompt, and then it'll return whether the user chose OK or cancel. So enough of me reading off slides. Let's actually do a little bit of practice with this. So if you haven't already opened up your text editor, you will want to do that now. So let's see. Let's go ahead and we're going to add our script up here. Now first I would like to go ahead and show you the styles here. So up here we had a UL class here. I'm going to go ahead and if I just define style equals, and then I can do like font size 30 pixels. And as you can see, it changes the font. So this is how you define an inline style. It's good if you just want like to test things out. But if you're going to actually implement it, you're going to want to put it into a style, a class, or an ID of some sort. So if you want to add JavaScript, you can use a script tag here. And we're just going to do alert, hello everyone. As you can see here, we got an alert saying hello everyone, and then we can just close it. And it'll go back to the regular site. So we don't want to do this inside the script tag here. We want to move this into its own file. So we're going to leave the opening and closing here, but we're going to do we're going to have to create a file. It's been a minute. Source equals, and we're just going to do let's do index.js, for example. I'm going to go ahead and create the file here, index.js. Now we have a JS file. And now, we save this. Nothing should pop up. But if we do the alert here now, and did I spell something wrong? Index.js. All right. So here is a good example of when you might have some errors. So we see that it's on port 5500. So we'll go localhost colon 5500. And we will, I'm going to open this in Firefox, because Firefox has a nice little console. So if we go to Web Developer Tools, and you will be able to see any errors. So we see the resource from localhost index.js was blocked due to MIME type mismatch.
You didn't put it in quotes.
I didn't. That is a good point. Thank you for pointing that out. And I also misspelled it. There we go. Awesome. So, your first experience debugging some JavaScript. Luckily, it's not like if you've ever done Ruby programming, it's absolutely horrendous about this. But luckily, JavaScript is pretty good about telling you what the error is. Sometimes they're cryptic, but most of the time they're not. So, yeah. So we have our alert here. Now, let's do a prompt. So we'll prompt, what is your name? And we want to take this prompt and we want to assign it to a variable. So var name equals prompt. And now, once we're done with that, we're going to alert name.
Don't put it in quotes this time.
I'm glad you're here. It's been a really long week. If anybody is going to Reflections Projections who's in this meeting, I've been so tired. it's, but yeah, back to this. Well, it printed name, just not my name, because I put it in quotes. What's your name? Christian? There we go. Now it alerts Christian. So you see how we pulled the data from the result here, and we alerted out to the screen. Now alerts, you can use alerts. They're not really, generally you would want a more, if you're doing like some sort of UX, UI design, I'm sure that there's a better explanation. But when you're doing a website, you generally do not want to use alerts unless it's for like something serious, like the user, you really, really want to pull the user's attention because unless your website is designed around Google standards or whatever, it's going to look out of place. So generally you would have your own sort of alert implemented. But this is a good example of sort of showing something on the screen. But if you wanted to say just show it in a log, write it to a log, you can also use console.log. So it's going to ask me for the name still. I'm actually going to go here because we won't be able to see the console in Safari. Type in my name, and as you can see here, it prints it out to the console. So great. Now the last one was confirm. So we're going to go ahead and move this back to and comments are just // we're going to go ahead and move this back to alert name without the quotes. And we'll do a confirm. And while and for loops, they're basically all the exact same as any other language you've done. I'm going to assume you've probably done a little bit of programming before. So while loops and everything are going to be the exact same. So we're going to do while confirm. Would you like to enter another name equals true? Prompt. And alert. All right, so enter my name, Christian. Awesome. There's my name. Would you like to enter another name? Okay. What's your name? Not Christian. Okay, yep, there's my name. Would you like to enter another name? Nope. Cancel. Awesome. And now string interpolation is super easy in JavaScript. So if I want to say like, your name is I didn't put it on the second one, so I'll have to do this real quick. Okay. So imagine I had dementia. I would put it in here, and eventually I would just get it back. I would have it very clearly. It says what my name is. So yeah, there you go. And no, I do not want to enter it again. So that is how you would get some information from the user. Now, normally you would use like an input field or something, but if you wanted to test some stuff and get some inputs, that's a way to do it. And it's good for manipulating data. If you just want to grab something, put it in, and then do something with it. So, save that. Awesome. Now, let's get back to the presentation. So, functions in JavaScript are extremely important. You build functions, and these functions will usually be called when an event happens. JavaScript is JavaScript is very, very flexible. You can actually program JavaScript like you can Haskell. You can program it functionally as well as you can program it in multiple different paradigms. And it's very, very flexible, so that is one of the powerful features of JavaScript. But we're going to be doing, most of the time JavaScript is written as event-driven, and all of its syntax sort of aligns with that. Eventually we'll get into like Lambda functions in the next meeting. But for now, you have defining a function, super simple. You write function, the name of the function, the parameters for the parameter names of the functions, because again, JavaScript is not typed, so it is dynamically typed. So you do not need to put the variable type when you're defining the parameters. And then you also do not need to assign a return type. It'll either return, if it doesn't return anything, it'll return undefined. Otherwise, it'll return whatever you tell it to return. So here we're returning a plus b, and you would just call it with add 2, 3, and that would return 5. Again, and then this is the normal way you would write a function. Then there is, as we see here, we're using const. Generally, if you're writing a function, you would use const because you're not really going to be reassigning the function, that variable to another function. But you can actually sort of, for right now, just think of it as a way of like renaming a function. But in the future, you'll see there will be a couple different reasons why you'll want to why you want to do this. But it is important to recognize it in case you're reading some JavaScript code. So you would write it const, and then whatever the name of your function, and then you do equal to function, and then same syntax as before. But we're setting the function equal to something. Now you could leave off the first part, and the name of your function would be add. But if you do it this way, your function's name will be myAddFunction. And then another very common way of writing it is anonymous functions. Anonymous functions do not have a name, hence anonymous. But in this example that I had messed up, I just realized, because this should be there we go, fix that. You'll still define it as you did before, but you wouldn't have the function's name. You would just define it as function AB, return A plus B. They act similar to Lambda functions, but JavaScript does have its own Lambda functions called arrow functions, which we'll look at next meeting. But this is another common way that you'll see functions defined. You may be wondering, why do we need essentially 4 different ways to write a function? They all sort of interact differently. It's important to understand that once you write a function in the main program, it's going to be accessible from anywhere. It's going to be global. But if you define it as a variable, well, the variable will be only accessible within that block. And then anonymous functions are part of sort of Lambda functions. And a lot of times you want to write a function, but it'll execute immediately. This is why you have anonymous functions, because they don't always need a name. They'll just be executed at certain points. So yeah, JavaScript is very powerful in this sense and also very confusing. So now we do have these JavaScript functions, but why do we need to use functions? Why am I teaching you this so early? That's because generally whenever you're writing your HTML code, there's going to be some event handlers. So in this one, we're looking at button, which is an HTML element. And this is how you define it. It's just a button. Click me, whatever you want on the button, and then you close it /button. So, but you're going to want to add an attribute called onClick. And we'll look at some other event handlers at the end of this presentation. But you'll have onClick, and then it'll execute some code. Me and these quotes are not doing so well today. Yeah, so it'll execute some code. Usually you'll have a function in here, and then it will do whatever is written in there. So I do want to quickly show how you would implement this in here. So we had a button. We're just going to add a button after our list here. Our fancy site button. Now if we save it, you'll see that we have a button here. It doesn't do anything at the moment. Now this is the default style. You can style this in many, many, many ways. But for right now, we're just going to leave it the default style. Whatever your browser is, they all have different default styles. But whenever we want to create a function here. So we're going to create a function. We're going to do ask for name and alert. We're not going to ask for anything here. We're going to do a prompt. What is your name? And then an alert of the name. Make sure you assign it. What did you say?
What you're doing.
Oh.
I thought you forgot that.
Awesome. Save that. Go in here. And when we do onClick, we're going to execute our function, which I've already forgotten the name of. Ask for name and, did I capitalize? This is why you shouldn't use long variable names, guys. We're going to execute that. Now, whenever I click this, what is your name? And there we go. Executes the function. So, extremely useful. You'll see this all the time. You go onClick, and then it'll execute something. Great way to handle this. So, just wanted to show you that real quick before we get to the next part, because the next part is going to be a bit of a doozy. DOM manipulation. DOM manipulation is important to learn. This is how you interact with the actual HTML code that in CSS on the page. You actually can modify the page itself with JavaScript. So what is DOM? DOM stands for Document Object Model. So as you can see, we have on the left, we have a standard piece of JavaScript here, or a standard piece of HTML. And then on the right, you'll see the DOM. This is how the browser looks at whatever content is on there. So we have HTML. It's got head and body. It's got a section, title. It's got some text on it, and some attributes. So yeah, there's a lot of important things to look at here. It's important to understand that this is how it structures that data whenever you're actually writing it. So what if we wanted to modify something on the page? We would need to first get some element from the DOM or on the page. So you'd use document.querySelector A. This would get the first anchor element. If you query selector all, you can get all of the A elements. You can get an element by the ID, as we saw before. This is the most common way you'll see it. Normally, you won't see query selector or query selector all. You'll see a lot of get element by ID, because this will get, whenever you define an ID, this is how you would reference it in JavaScript. And then you can also get them by tag name, which is very similar to query selector all. It's just sort of an older version, especially if you're working with some older browsers, you may have to use that. Now, these all will return elements of type node or HTML element. So some common ones that this will have is, for example, node.textContent, or if it's a link, it'll have a .href. And you can actually modify these. And then if you want to actually manipulate and add and remove data and modify attributes, you would use the create element. This will return, so you would always set these you would always set these equal to something, because it will return a bunch of data. So, or return that node. So you want to set these like var anchor tag equals document.querySelector A. So you want to set this to something so that you can actually manage that. And then right here, we create an element. And then we would have already referenced our node that we want to append to. And we'll use whatever node we want to append to. Dot append child, and then that'll append the new element that we just created, that P element. We can also remove that element. We can set the color, that we can do style, node.style whatever, font color, font size, whatever CSS, you can actually change it here in JavaScript. And then, but usually you wouldn't do that. Normally you would have a class that you would assign, and then you would just do node.setAttribute class, and then the class name. So, like I said, it's a lot really quickly. We got started a little bit late, so I'm not trying to rush through, but I also want to get through and not go too far over time. So, let's go ahead and we're going to go ahead and change this to change the page. Okay, we'll save that. Then here we'll change this to change the page. So let's go in, we'll still get the name, but we're going to change this a little bit of a different way. So we're going to go ahead and do var site title. We'll do site header for not confusing. Document dot query selector, and I believe this is an H1. And then we would set the site header dot text content equal to name. Now if we save this and run it, assuming I could spell my own name right, it would change this to whatever I just typed in. So as we can see right here, we got this H1, we got the first H1 on the page, and then we changed the text content to the name. So we can do this with an A as we did in the example. And it changes the first A to my name. We can do this with li. This will get the first list item, which is this one over here on the HTML DOM. So you saw the hierarchy that was in that picture. That hierarchy, it'll go through the first one that it finds, and it'll change that. If you wanted to, we'll learn about some special ways to handle arrays in the next meeting. But we can get all of them. I don't believe this will work. Try. No, it won't. But you would have to go into here and choose the 0th element of that, because it'll return an array of these elements. And we'll learn more about arrays. So there, it changed the 0th index. We could change the first one it sees on the page, or the second one technically. So yeah, it changed it right there. So, awesome. Now, show you the more important one. Let's set this button here. We'll get an ID of main button. Document.get element by ID. It also has by class name as well. If you want to do by like all the elements with that class, you could do it that way. It'll return an array. Main button. Main button. Main button. You clicked me. It's still asking, but you just hit enter. Now it says you clicked me. Awesome. So hopefully this is good for being able to see how you would reference these and change some basic stuff about it. Now you can also add elements. So, or not, still prompt for what is your name, but we're going to grab the first we're going to create our own list item here. So var name list item equals document dot create element li, and then you would append it to the whatever node you're adding to. So var main unordered list equals document dot get element by name, or sorry, query selector. We're going to use, normally you would make an ID for this. Query selector, grab the UL, and then main unordered list dot append name list item here, and we do want to set the text content of name list item to name. Awesome. So now if we hit this button, type in my name, and now you'll see that it adds me to this list. So pretty cool, pretty powerful. You can do a bunch of different things. So I do want to go over real quick the JavaScript events. So you have your on click, on mouse over, on mouse out, on key down, and on load. So these are all pretty self-explanatory. There's a couple more. You can look at them on the Mozilla page that defines the standard, or you can look into like W3 Schools or something like that. But I want to test out this on mouse over and on mouse out. I'll show you how that works. Add my name. You can't use spaces in the variable name. Add my name. And then we'll do a function. Remove my name. Go ahead and remove this. And we're going to use this remove child. So we're going to go ahead now. This will be kind of I'm going to go ahead and set up the ID on this. So name list item dot ID equals name list item. That way we can reference it later. For name list item equals document dot get element by ID name list item. That way, get rid of that. Dot remove, and that way it'll remove my name. That way we can do on mouse enter, and then on add my name, on mouse leave. I think it might be on mouse leave, not on mouse out. I think on my mouse out might be an older version. I might have picked up by accident. I believe I did remove my name. Remove my name. So we have add my name, remove my name. So if I hover over it, it asks me my name. And it glitched out. Now, so if you have a keen eye, it'll be pretty clear why that is, because whenever I added the name, it moved the button down, which was outside of my mouse cursor, and then because it moved out, it would delete the name. So, yeah, that's what happened there. So you can think about a way to fix that. It's not that important. All that's important is that you know that it works and how events work. So yeah, let's go ahead and yeah. So you can do like Boolean if you wanted to, like var name showing equals false, then when the mouse is clicked, toggle name, and you would just do like if name showing. Could do this. Not name showing. So if it's not showing, we'll go ahead and add it. And then we'll set name showing equals not name showing. Else, we're going to remove it.
The stream is like having trouble.
It's cutting out.
It's behind, I think. It's that. I think the stream's lagging.
It's died.
Oh yeah, we are not able right now on my screen.
Huh. Yeah, it doesn't look like. Okay. How about now? I think.
It's working fine for me.
Okay. Yeah, he said it's working fine for him. So yeah, and then whenever you, if it's not toggled, we'll add this. That way we can toggle the name showing and not showing. Let me change this to. Well, it deletes the whole thing, but it's close enough. Not quite what we're looking for, but you can look into the documentation and see why that might be happening. That'll be your homework. Look at this, see why it's not working. Give you a hint, make sure that you're referencing the right selector. But for the sake of time, I won't be going into it, and we'll look at it next week. So, yeah. You guys got to see looking at documentation, setting up some events, adding or removing data elements from the DOM, practicing with your HTML, got to learn a new HTML element. So lots of really fun stuff, really interesting stuff that you'll be able to use in the future. The next topics that you'll see, just want to quickly go over some next topics. We'll be looking at JavaScript objects. We'll be looking at the node object and explaining like a little bit about that object and how they're defined. If you thought variables were lazily defined, then objects, depending on if you like that or not, you're going to either love or hate objects because they're somehow even lazier. So yeah, that's going to be fun to learn. HTML forms, we're going to be learning because a button is part of a form. So you'll go and you can create a form with input fields, buttons, password fields, text elements, and we'll look at creating a form and submitting that, and how would you execute some JavaScript to run that form. We'll look at making that form a little bit prettier and making it responsive. And then after that, we'll look at API calls. And then after that, we'll look at frameworks and libraries, Angular, Vue, and React. So I hope I didn't hurt anybody's brain too much, and you're all still alive. So yeah, does anybody have any questions? I somehow managed to make it in under an hour. So thank you all for staying. Does anybody have any questions? No? Nothing? Alrighty. Well, this recording will be available after. It'll probably be available sometime tonight. I'll have to encode it and upload it to YouTube. I'll post the link in the channel. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, put it on the Discord, or send me a DM. Yeah. Thank you all for coming, and I'll see you next week.